Before we begin with our focus on writing and how you can improve your writing, what I thought we could do is just kind of zoom out and begin with an overview, the best research on what we know about how we learn languages. I think what you're going to find is that the way that we learn languages is actually a lot different than the way that you have probably been learning in school. There's been a big change in our understanding of the way that languages develop in people since about the 1950s, but education really hasn't caught up with that. So I'd like to introduce you to the latest research on how we learn languages so that you can take control of your own writing, even outside of this course. And what we're going to call that approach is the natural approach. That's what it's been known as, the natural approach to learning languages. Now, before I introduce you to all the theory and everything behind it, I just want to begin with a story of really one of my first few years teaching English. I was here in Korea. I first began at an academy and then later to public schools. And in my experience, you would have a classroom, and of course, there would be some students who were better than others, but overall, there was a kind of average. There was a certain kind of level that all the Korean students at a certain age would have. And so I would be really surprised every so often, once in every 3 and 4 classes, I would get a student who's just so fluent. Like, not only do they have all the grammar down, but they're just speaking without an accent and just so casually and so naturally. And I would always say, "Oh wow, like you speak so well. What's your secret? Did you go to a good academy? Did you live in America or something like that? Like, how do you speak so well?" They all told me the same thing. They didn't go to an academy. They've never left Korea. But when they were young, they really liked to watch Disney movies. Okay, so I heard that, the first time. I thought, oh, interesting. Second time I heard it. By the third or fourth time, I was starting to think of, what is it? Like, what's going on here? What is it about Disney movies that's making these students just so fluent, like way outside of the class average? How does that work? So I was kind of hanging on to that question for a long time, and I never really got an answer to it until I did my master's in education. I focused on teaching English. And so at that time, we were learning, how do we learn languages? What does the research show? And therefore, how can we teach languages in a way that's in line with that research? And it was only when I was studying language learning in this program that it clicked. I realized what it is that makes Disney movies cause these students to speak so fluently. So check this out. Many of you might know this book. It's a very famous book called *Sapiens*. And the book basically tries to answer one question. Why do humans control the world? Why isn't it dogs? Why isn't it birds? Why is it humans? Homo sapiens conquered the world thanks above all, there were many things that helped us, but above all, the most important thing that helped us control the world was our language, what he calls our unique language. There's something special about our language. So what is that? What's that unique feature of human language that led us to control the world? So if you examine other group animals like humans, other primates and wolves and these species that organize themselves around an alpha, one kind of leader person in the group, those species, they have a maximum number. That group can only grow to a maximum of about 150. That's called Dunbar's number. Dunbar is the scientist who discovered this number, who proposed it. And he thinks it's basically a limitation of our brain. We can really only manage 150 social relationships. And that's true across all animal kingdoms. But the author, Harari, in that book, *Sapiens*, he's saying that there's something special about human language that lets us get outside of this limitation. So what is special about human language that lets us beat this number, Dunbar's number? Well, if you look at the communication of all other animals, monkeys and dogs, they can talk about things that exist. A monkey can say danger over there, food over there, I'm angry, I'm hungry, these kinds of things. They have, you can call it signaling. If you don't want to call it language, they can signal things. They can talk about what's happening in the world. Of course, humans can do that too. But the unique thing about human language is that not only can we talk about things that exist, we can also talk about things that don't exist. And that's something that no other species can do. We can imagine concepts and ideas that you can't point to in the world. Things like money, human rights. Point out to the world, where's a human right? Show me what a human right is. It's an idea. It doesn't exist, but it's something that allows people to cooperate on a set of values. Religion and even team sports work this way. It's amazing. You can have nations of people cooperating with each other, all organized around this imaginary idea of a country, of money, these concepts that do not exist in any other species. We have them because of our unique language. So that is the feature of human language that allows us to cooperate in groups larger than 150, and that is the key to our success. The fact that humans can cooperate in these very, very large groups, that was the key to our flourishing, and that is the reason why we have taken over the world. So when you understand language as being the central thing to being a human, it's the technology that we use to organize ourselves into these really large groups, that's our survival advantage. Like essentially, if you go back in evolutionary history, all the Homo sapiens who didn't have language, well, they couldn't cooperate in the group and they died. They got eaten by wolves. They couldn't play the same language game that we were playing. They couldn't coordinate themselves. So language is part of being a human being. It is essential to you. It's going to turn out that it's actually biological. In other words, forget the idea that you're not good at language. We all have this. It's part of being human, and if you put your brain in the right conditions, you will inevitably, you can't help it, you will acquire the language. But that word acquire is actually pretty important because to acquire a language is somehow different than learning it. So let's think a little bit about what that difference is. A lot of education is organized around learning. And when we talk about learning, I guess what we're really talking about is behavior. As a teacher, we're trying to get our students to model a certain behavior. We want them to do a certain action. And when they do the right action, we give them a reward, a good grade. And when they do the wrong action or they don't do it, we give them a bad grade. And this is straight from Skinner. Skinner was the psychologist who did all these experiments with rats. He'd have a rat in a little box. And anytime the rat did the behavior that Skinner wanted him to do, boom, he'd give him a pellet. The Skinner had the rat doing all these complicated behaviors to get the food. And that's the way it goes. Through positive reward, the rat learns the appropriate behavior. And that's basically what we call learning. This is basically the way the education system is set up. You come to school, if you're good, the teacher likes you. If you're doing the bad behavior, you get punished. If you do well on the tests, you get a good grade. If you don't understand the material, you get a bad grade. It's all behaviorism. It's actually a problem that we treat language education the same way that we treat math education. Because language and math and language and music, and language is a very special field. It's not like these other subjects. It's not even knowledge. The way that music is knowledge and math is knowledge. Language is not knowledge. And so it's kind of a mistake that we treat it the same way in school. We learned this in the 1950s. So in the 1950s, there was a big revolution in linguistics, just like the Copernicus revolution, when we realized the planets weren't orbiting the Earth, but we were all orbiting the sun. Similarly, we had a big revolution in linguistics in the 1950s, and that is when this professor from MIT, Noam Chomsky, came along and basically proposed that language is not behavioral. It's biological. He proposed this idea of a language acquisition device in the brain. And it's true, there is some part of the brain that is made for language. That's the way that you learned to speak your own native language, right? If you're a Korean speaker, you didn't go to the Korean Hagwon. You took in the language and then one day magically started using it. That's the language acquisition device at work. It's a part of your brain because you are a human. You're Homo sapien. So that's what Chomsky showed us. He said it doesn't really make sense to treat language as a behavior, as Skinner would have it. It's actually a lot more biological. And so if it's biological, then we need to focus on inputs. What does this part of the brain need in order to acquire a language? And so we can go back and think about how you learned your own native language. Okay, what happened? You were a baby and you didn't have any language, but you were looking out at the world and you were trying to understand what's going on. And here's this nice woman and she's making these sounds and okay, and you want to understand what's going on. So you find it all very interesting. You're paying attention and you want to know and you're taking it in. And eventually you start to hear patterns. Anytime this woman walks into the room, you hear Alma, Alma, Alma. And then one day you try it. You make the sound, you say Alma. And then she looks, it's like, oh, that must be Alma. So when I say Alma, she looks. Okay, great, got it. And you just build up from there. That's the way it goes. So you need interesting material. You actually need to be interested in getting the language, in finding the meaning. It can't be boring material that you don't care about. You've got to be compelled. You've got to find it interesting. That's the first condition of language acquisition. And the second condition of language acquisition is positive affect. So Chomsky talked about this filter. The Korean word for filter is pilta. So there's this filter between you and the language. And when there's stress, it doesn't matter how interesting you find the material. It doesn't even matter how good you are, how much you understand. When the stress barrier is up, it becomes impossible to acquire the language. And so that's why, of course, when you're a baby and you feel good, it's very easy to take in the language. But when you're writing a test or your teacher calls you and makes you give a presentation in your second language in front of the class, your stress goes up, your language shuts down, you can't remember how to say a single word in the language. That's the stress barrier. So you need to have positive affect in order to acquire the language. You need to feel good. Now this input, comprehensible input, that's an important factor. The idea of comprehensible input means that you need to have some level of understanding, because if you don't understand anything, then you're just not going to be able to make the connections that you need. For example, I don't speak any Russian. If I go and listen to the Russian radio station for 20 years, it doesn't matter. I'm not going to learn Russian that way. It needs to be input at the right level. So you need to be able to understand what you're reading. And I stress that because I work with a lot of graduate students here at UNIS at my university. And for their studies, they're required to read 2, 3, 4 papers a week, scientific papers, which is very difficult stuff. It has a lot of very technical vocabulary, and academic writing has some complex grammatical structures, and that can be very difficult. So when I meet with them, they say, oh yeah, I read all the time. No, you don't. It's not helping your language ability if you don't have a good level of comprehension. What's a good level of comprehension? All the research shows that an appropriate level of reading material for language acquisition, you should be able to understand 98% of what you're reading. That means for every 100 words, there should be a maximum of 2 words that you don't know. And that's because when there's a word that you don't know, what we do is we use the words around it in order to guess the meaning of it. But if there are 3, 4, 5 words on a page that you don't know, it becomes really difficult to guess what the meaning is. And so you're just not going to be getting any input. It's not comprehensible. So you may as well be listening to the Russian radio station. But all of this brings us back to this point about Disney. Why were all of my most fluent students really engaged with Disney movies when they were younger? Well, this gave me the reason. Disney movies are comprehensible, okay? They use very simple language and everything is animated, right? So it becomes, even if you don't know what some of the words are, when you're watching, you can guess the meaning just based on the situation and the context, and it's comprehensible. And second, of course, it's fun. It feels good to watch Disney movies. I'm sure these students didn't even realize that they were watching a movie in English. They just enjoyed the movie. They were interested in it. Now, of course, they were fluent speakers because they focused so much on listening. They were listening to Disney movies. But if you want to be a good writer, then you need to focus on reading. Reading is the comprehensible input that you need to become a fluent writer. Unfortunately, here in South Korea, which has one of the highest literacy rates in the developed world, it actually has the lowest rate of pleasure reading in the entire OECD. In other words, people here in Korea, they know how to read, they just don't want to. Now, we have some interesting research about why those rates are so low here in South Korea. So there was a study out of Busan National University that was asking a group of 127 student educators. So they were students in university who were studying to become teachers. So this group, you would think this is going to be a highly literate group. And so out of this group of 127, only 11% of those soon-to-be teachers reported doing pleasure reading regularly. Okay, so this whole group, very few of them were actually reading for fun. Now, when they asked them why, what was the reason for not reading, the largest percentage of them said that the reason that they weren't doing pleasure reading is because they were tested. All the reading that they were doing, they were being tested on after. And so that's it. When we're giving students reading passages and we're saying, okay, read this and do you understand it and do this test, that's sucking the joy out of it. People don't like reading if they're being tested on it at the end. And so that's a big mistake. We need to find, as educators, we need to just find ways to introduce students to reading and encourage it and not tie it to their tests. So it's a big problem that here in South Korea, so much reading is tested at the end. We need to find ways to introduce the fun and joy of reading to students. So let's look at a few statistics here. Okay, the academic word list. That is a list of about 180 or 200 words that occur with very high frequency in academic writing. But they're the kind of words that we don't say in speaking or we write about in newspapers and blogs. It's the kind of stuff that we do in university. There are about 200 of those words. You need to see a word in natural language 10 to 15 times before you totally understand it perfectly. Okay, so we've got 200 words and you need to see a new word in natural context about 10 to 15 times. So if you read the Harry Potter books, numbers 1 to 7, if you did that, then you would learn naturally 1/5 to 1/2 of all the academic words, all the words that you need for advanced writing in university. If you just read Harry Potter one time, you would see those words 10 to 15 times and you would have mastered them way more than you ever could have by studying vocabulary like this. So that's one of the benefits of free voluntary reading. You naturally acquire the language that you need. And it's fun. You don't even realize it. Harry Potter's awesome. Just read Harry Potter and you'll have all the vocabulary you need. And so students will often want to study on an app. One that I really recommend is this app called LAngUAgeS. LAngUAgeS is an app that's built around all the research that I've been showing to you. What it does is it gives you a library of material that you can read in your target language. So that means that you can find interesting material and you can find material that's at the right level. Comprehensible input. I highly, highly recommend LAngUAgeS. I'll leave a link to it down below. But there you have the most recent research we have on how to learn languages. Language is biological. It's part of your body. So forget the idea that you're not good at languages, you're a math person, you're a science person. No, you're not. You're a language person because you're a person. Everybody has language. It's part of being human if you give yourself the right conditions. But if you're having trouble with writing, I would bet that you're not reading. I would bet that you're not reading very much in English. And so in this course, I'm going to be showing you some of the ways that you can improve your writing. But ultimately, it's going to be back to this same school model. I'm going to be teaching it to you. And fine, it's okay to have a little bit of instruction. But if you really want to make significant improvements in your language, you've got to focus on reading the right material. And so what is the right material? It's material that you find interesting. Whatever you're interested in, that's the right material. It shouldn't feel like studying. It shouldn't feel like, time to study English. You've got to forget that. You've just got to develop this hobby of reading in English, whatever it is that you're interested in. And the right level is 98% comprehension. It can't be too difficult. If you find yourself stopping every few words to look it up in the dictionary, close the book, pick up a different one. It's got to feel good. You've got to be moving through it easily, quickly. And if you don't have that material right now, again, I think this app LAngUAgeS is a great place to start because it gives you libraries of material starting from the alphabet all the way up to, the most advanced stuff that you could be reading. So definitely check it out.